47 engineers had spent 8 months tearing apart the $30 million helicopter belonging to CEO Preston Ashford, and every single one of them signed the same conclusion. The machine was dead. In a hangar crowded with specialists holding diplomas from the finest universities in the country, Nolan Price, a night-shift ground equipment technician written off as a lower-tier mechanic, asked for exactly 3 minutes. Some of them laughed. Preston set a stopwatch on the table without a word, his eyes cold and amused. Nolan knelt beside the aircraft and touched a detail nobody else had bothered to notice. 3 minutes later, the engine roared to life. But the truth buried underneath that single failure was about to bring the entire company to its knees. Before Nolan exposes what 47 engineers missed, tap subscribe now so you never miss a reveal that leaves an entire industry speechless. The Aurelius HX-9 had sat motionless inside its private hangar at Ashford Aeronautics for 8 straight months, a twin-engine executive aircraft once celebrated by the press as an office in the sky. It had been Preston Ashford's personal symbol of power, the machine he flew to board meetings and press conferences to remind everyone exactly who controlled the company. After a $2 million interior upgrade, the helicopter suddenly refused to start, its display locked on a single relentless warning that claimed the rotor brake remained engaged, even though mechanical inspection confirmed it had been released. 11 separate technical teams were rotated through the investigation over those 8 months, each one replacing sensors, control boxes, wiring harnesses, and onboard computers, and each time the same warning returned within days. The total cost of diagnosis and replacement had already crossed $6,800,000. An amount that made even seasoned engineers wince when it appeared on the ledger. A task force of 47 engineers finally signed a joint report recommending the aircraft be permanently retired, declaring the central wiring architecture degraded beyond reasonable repair. Preston needed that final verdict locked down before a board meeting scheduled 3 days later, because he intended to use the failure of the HX-9 as leverage to push the board into approving 6 brand-new helicopters. Nolan Price worked in ground support, far from the executive hangar, hauling generators and tow equipment through the maintenance yard on the overnight shift. Passing near the HX-9 one evening, he heard a relay clicking inside the fuselage in a rhythm that struck him as wrong, not the clean pattern of a software fault, but something mechanical underneath it. He paused only a few seconds, studying the warning light before a young engineer waved him off, telling him the restricted area was reserved for senior specialists. Nolan didn't argue. He simply remembered the exact location the sound had come from, filing it away the way he filed away everything that didn't add up. That same evening, Nolan called his daughter, Sadie, to let her know he would be home late again. He had chosen the night shift specifically so he could still walk her to school in the mornings, a small trade-off that mattered more to him than any promotion ever could. The call lasted only a minute, just enough for her to hear his voice and for him to hear hers, and then he went back to work without another word about it. As the engineering team prepared to seal the control panel shut for the night, Nolan noticed a faint scorch mark circling one bolt near the panel's edge, a mark nobody had written down in any of the reports stacked on the table beside them. He thought about mentioning it right then, standing at the edge of the restricted zone with a tow cable still coiled over his shoulder, but the young engineer's earlier warning kept him quiet. Instead, he memorized the position relative to the access hatch, counting the bolts from the hinge the way he'd once trained himself to remember instrument panels in low visibility. 8 months of failure had a way of making people stop looking at small things, he thought, because small things felt beneath the size of the problem everyone believed they were solving. He had seen that mistake before on rescue aircraft where an entire crew chased a phantom hydraulic fault for weeks, while the real cause turned out to be a single corroded pin no bigger than a fingernail. The size of the panic never matched the size of the cause, not in his experience, and he doubted this machine would be any different. The following morning, Nolan asked his direct supervisor for permission to look at the HX9's maintenance logbook. The supervisor laughed outright, reminding him that his description covered tow tractors and portable generators, nothing resembling executive aircraft. Nolan explained calmly that the scorch mark he'd seen could point to elevated resistance at a grounding point, a detail worth checking before anyone spent another dollar on new components. His comment traveled fast, and within hours it had become a running joke in the engineers' break room, where several of them started calling him the professor of the tow yard. Conrad Pike, the vice president of engineering, overheard the mockery and personally instructed Nolan to stay away from the project entirely, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Nolan mentioned that he had once served as an avionics electrician in the Coast Guard, hoping the context might earn him a moment of consideration. Conrad simply smiled and said field experience from a rescue unit meant nothing next to a team stacked with doctorates from the country's top engineering programs. Years earlier, Nolan had repaired rescue helicopters in brutal weather conditions where a single overlooked fault could cost lives, work that demanded exactly the kind of physical, hands-on diagnosis Conrad's team had abandoned in favor of software readouts. He hadn't left that world because he lacked the skill for it. He'd left because after his wife passed away, he needed a schedule stable enough to raise Sadie without missing the parts of her life that mattered most. Mara Ellison, a quality manager who had once worked alongside Nolan years before, quietly showed him a copy of the parts replacement list circulating through the engineering department. Looking it over, Nolan realized the entire team had been swapping out signal receivers and control modules without ever once measuring voltage drop at the grounding reference point, the one test that would have told them everything. He asked Mara if she could pull the records from the interior upgrade that had preceded the failure, since that timing felt far too convenient to ignore. Mara wanted to help, but she worried that stepping outside her lane would make Conrad see her as disloyal to the rest of the engineering staff. Nolan didn't ask her to take any risk on his behalf. He only asked her to check whether anyone had documented what happened when the panel covering the grounding point was removed for the interior refit. What she found stopped her cold. The section of the upgrade paperwork describing that removal had been stamped with a note claiming it carried no technical relevance whatsoever, a note that made no sense given what Nolan suspected. When Nolan studied a photograph of the panel taken before the refit, he saw exactly what he expected, a patch of bare metal where the grounding wire had once made direct contact, now completely sealed beneath a fresh layer of protective paint. Preston Ashford called a formal meeting inside the hangar itself to announce the engineering department's final verdict on the HX9. Board members, insurance representatives, the procurement team, and all 47 engineers filled the space, standing in a loose semicircle around the aircraft, which had been draped in black cloth as though awaiting a funeral. Conrad opened with a report running several hundred pages, insisting that the central wiring architecture had degraded beyond any reasonable path to repair. The estimated cost of restoration had been inflated until it sat nearly level with the price of buying a brand new aircraft outright. Bryce Harrington, the head of procurement, immediately followed with a polished presentation for 6 replacement helicopters from a manufacturer called Skycrest, timed perfectly to capitalize on the mood in the room. Preston praised his engineering team for having, in his words, the courage to admit when a machine was truly finished. Nolan happened to be wheeling equipment past the open hangar doors just as Conrad mentioned the rotor brake fault by name, and something about the phrasing made him stop walking. He asked, politely, if he could say something. Conrad instantly ordered security to escort him out, but Mara spoke up first, confirming in front of everyone that Nolan had real background in aviation electrical systems. Preston allowed him to speak only because the idea of a maintenance worker challenging his engineering department in front of investors struck him as entertaining rather than threatening. Nolan told the room plainly that the central wiring wasn't the problem at all, and that the fault sat somewhere far smaller and far more embarrassing. He pointed toward the panel near the rotor brake controller and explained that the system had effectively been electrically isolated from its own airframe. Laughter rippled across the hangar floor almost immediately. One senior engineer reminded him that the team had spent 8 full months on this exact aircraft, while Nolan had barely observed it from a distance for 8 minutes total. Conrad, smirking, asked how long Nolan thought he'd need to prove such a claim. Nolan answered without hesitation, 3 minutes to locate the fault and correct it. Preston set his own stopwatch down on the table in front of the assembled board, framing the moment as a spectacle rather than a serious technical challenge. If Nolan failed, Preston announced, he would be terminated on the spot for disrupting an official company meeting. If he somehow succeeded, Preston promised him 1 month's salary as a token reward, delivered with a tone that made it clear he expected no such payout would ever be necessary. Preston told the crowd that Nolan was trying to dress up luck as expertise in front of some of the sharpest minds in the aviation industry, and several engineers chuckled in agreement. The stopwatch started, and Nolan didn't reach for the oversized toolbox sitting nearby. He picked up a single wrench, a contact cleaning tool, and a small paper packet of new washers, nothing more. The hangar had gone almost completely silent by the time Nolan crouched beside the aircraft. The only sound the low hum of overhead lighting and the occasional shuffle of someone shifting their weight near the back wall. Preston folded his arms and watched with the expression of a man who had already decided how the next 3 minutes would end, certain that whatever followed would only confirm what his engineers had told him for 8 months straight. Conrad stood close enough to intervene at the first sign of trouble, his jaw tight, his eyes tracking every motion of Nolan's hands as though searching for an excuse to stop him early. Nolan asked Owen Calloway, the company's veteran test pilot, to confirm that all power to the aircraft had been fully cut before he touched anything near the control panel. He allowed no one to approach the panel while he worked, keeping the process methodical rather than rushed despite the ticking clock. In the first minute, he removed the small access panel near the rotor brake controller, the same section several engineers insisted had nothing to do with the failure. A few of them were still smiling, certain this would end exactly the way they expected. In the second minute, Nolan disconnected the grounding wire and revealed a thin, glassy layer of clear paint coating the contact surface beneath it, a detail invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. He showed Mara a faint scorch pattern circling the bolt, evidence of repeated arcing where the connection kept trying and failing to complete itself. He explained, without raising his voice, that the paint layer was blocking the return path the electrical system needed to reach the airframe, sending false signals that convinced the computer the rotor brake was still locked. Conrad tried to intervene, claiming Nolan was damaging a protective anti-corrosion coating that the team had deliberately left untouched. Nolan used only the approved cleaning tool, working the small contact patch according to standard maintenance procedure, rather than improvising anything risky. He fitted a new serrated washer into place and torqued the bolt down to its specified value, his hands steady the entire time. When he finished, the stopwatch read 2 minutes and 41 seconds. Nolan stepped back from the panel and asked Owen to restore power to the aircraft. The rotor brake warning vanished from the display instantly. The stopwatch showed 2 minutes and 54 seconds. Owen began the standard ground start sequence without hesitation, following protocol exactly as trained. The first engine caught and stabilized cleanly just before the 3-minute mark passed. The sound rolled across the hangar, and for several long seconds, nobody among the 47 engineers said a single word. Preston stood frozen, staring at the aircraft he had planned to sell for scrap value only minutes earlier. Bryce quietly closed the folder containing his procurement pitch for 6 new helicopters, sliding it off the table without meeting anyone's eyes. Conrad insisted loudly that Nolan had simply gotten lucky. Nolan replied that luck didn't create arc scorching on a bolt, and luck certainly didn't paint over a grounding contact by accident. Preston, eager to salvage the moment in front of his investors, demanded an immediate test flight to prove the aircraft was fully operational. Nolan stopped him, insisting the helicopter still needed a complete inspection before anyone considered putting it in the air. Preston mocked him publicly, accusing him of wanting credit for the fix while somehow lacking the confidence to let the machine fly. Owen sided with Nolan without a second's hesitation, refusing to pilot the aircraft until proper certification had been completed and signed off. A murmur moved through the crowd of engineers, some of them exchanging glances that suggested they were already replaying the last 8 months in their heads, wondering how they had missed something a maintenance worker had spotted in under 3 minutes. One older engineer quietly asked Mara whether the diagnostic software had ever flagged a grounding fault at all, and she admitted it hadn't, because the software had never been told to look there in the first place. Preston, sensing the mood shifting away from him, tried to redirect the conversation back toward the investors gathered near the hangar entrance, insisting the repair only proved his engineering team's diligence had finally paid off. Nobody in the room quite believed that framing, though nobody said so out loud yet. While examining the access panel more closely afterward, Nolan noticed a paint batch code stamped along its edge, a code that made him realize the grounding contact hadn't been mistakenly coded once. It had likely happened as part of a pattern. Preston quietly instructed the communications department not to mention Nolan's name in any account of what had happened in the hangar that day. Conrad drafted a revised report describing Nolan's repair as merely the final procedural step within the engineering team's larger diagnostic strategy. Nolan's name appeared nowhere in the finished document, erased as thoroughly as if he had never entered the building. All 47 engineers were asked to sign a statement affirming that the repair represented a collective achievement of the department as a whole. Some of them felt the unfairness of it settle uncomfortably in their stomachs, yet none dared push back against Conrad directly. Preston summoned Nolan to his private office the following afternoon and handed him an envelope containing 1 month's salary in cash, exactly as promised in front of the board. In exchange, Nolan was expected to sign a non-disclosure agreement stating that he had merely followed instructions issued by Conrad throughout the repair. Nolan refused outright. Preston reminded him, almost gently, that he was a single father carrying a mortgage he couldn't easily afford to lose, implying gratitude was the only reasonable response to still having a job at all. Nolan told him that money could buy silence, but it couldn't rewrite the timestamps already recorded in the maintenance logbook. Preston's expression hardened, and he accused Nolan of attempting to extort the company he had just helped save. Within a day, Nolan's access badge to the executive hangar was revoked entirely. Conrad began quietly digging through his personnel file, searching for any justification that might support a formal termination. Mara discovered that the original interior refit proposal had explicitly required cleaning the contact surface after painting, a standard precaution any competent technician would expect. That instruction had been deleted from the version ultimately delivered to the maintenance crew, and the person who approved the change was Conrad Pike himself. Nolan also uncovered that roughly $6,800,000 in replaced components had never actually returned to the company's inspection warehouse as required. Several parts logged as defective had instead been quietly sold off to an outside intermediary company few people had ever heard of. Tracing the ownership of that intermediary eventually led back to an investment fund managed by Bryce Harrington's younger brother, a connection that explained far more than either Nolan or Mara had initially expected. Nolan sat with the printout for a long time that night after Sadie had gone to bed, tracing the same string of transactions over and over until the pattern stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like design. He thought about the 8 months of replaced sensors and control boxes, the $6,800,000 spent chasing a fault that had never lived where anyone was told to look. None of it had been incompetence, not really. It had been a machine built out of good people following bad instructions, each of them too specialized, too siloed, too trusting of the process handed down to them to ever step back and see the whole shape of what was happening. That thought unsettled him more than the fraud itself, because it meant the same thing could happen again with any aircraft in the fleet, under any team, as long as the person controlling the questions stayed in charge of who got to ask them. Nolan and Mara spent several evenings cross-referencing 3 separate categories of paperwork: the full repair history of the HX-9, invoices for every replacement component, and procurement records tied to the proposed purchase of 6 new helicopters. What emerged was unmistakable. Conrad and Bryce had known about the grounding fault for months before Nolan ever touched the aircraft. If the HX-9 had been repaired cheaply and quickly, the board would never have approved a replacement fleet worth over $180 million, and the entire scheme would have collapsed before it began. Bryce had already negotiated a hidden commission with Skycrest, the manufacturer supplying the proposed replacement helicopters, a commission tied directly to the size of the order. Conrad steered engineering teams toward the most complex, most expensive components imaginable, ensuring the repair bill climbed month after month without ever revealing the simple truth underneath. Each time a functional component was pulled from the aircraft, the shell company purchased it back at scrap value before quietly reselling it on the open market for a healthy profit. The total amount siphoned out of Ashford Aeronautics through this arrangement had climbed into the millions of dollars over time. Conrad hadn't needed to involve any of the 47 engineers in outright fraud to make this work. He only needed to control what data they saw, what procedures they followed, and, most importantly, which questions they were permitted to ask in the first place. Digging further, Nolan realized he had submitted a report 7 years earlier warning about exactly this kind of risk, describing how painting over grounding points during interior work could cause intermittent electrical faults. That report had gone straight to Conrad's office and had never been circulated or acted upon in any way. Mara wanted to send everything they'd gathered directly to the board immediately. Nolan asked her to restrict herself strictly to records within her own job scope, worried that reaching beyond that line might expose her to accusations of improperly accessing company data. Preston learned they were digging and ordered Nolan's work computer confiscated without warning or explanation. Conrad simultaneously produced a report accusing Nolan of performing unauthorized repairs that endangered the HX-9 and everyone connected to it. Preston signed off on Nolan's termination that same afternoon. Standing before dozens of employees gathered in the hangar, the CEO announced that Nolan wasn't some hidden genius, only an undisciplined mechanic who had gotten lucky once. Security confiscated Nolan's employee badge on the spot. Not one of the 47 engineers stepped forward to defend him, even as several exchanged uneasy glances they didn't voice aloud. Just before he reached the parking gate, Nolan received a message from Owen warning him that Preston intended to fly the HX-9 in a public demonstration the very next morning, without ever checking the remaining grounding points that might carry the same hidden flaw. Nolan stood by his truck for a long moment, keys in hand, staring back at the hangar lights glowing behind the fence line. 3 days earlier, he had been the man nobody in that building would even let finish a sentence. And now he was the only person outside it who understood exactly what was wrong with the aircraft. Preston planned to fly in front of cameras. He could walk away and let the consequences fall wherever they landed, and some quiet, tired part of him almost wanted to. But he thought of Sadie asking him if the story on the news was true, and he knew that whatever came next, he wasn't going to spend it pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen. Local news outlets picked up a press statement released by Ashford Aeronautics within hours, describing Nolan as an employee who had tampered improperly with the CEO's personal aircraft. Preston used the narrative to shield Conrad's reputation and to keep the replacement fleet purchase moving forward without scrutiny. Back home, Nolan sat at his kitchen table calculating how many months he could realistically cover his mortgage payments without steady income coming in. Sadie appeared only briefly, asking her father whether the news story was true, whether he'd really done something dangerous the way the report claimed. Nolan explained that he had followed proper procedure the entire time and had simply refused to sign his name to a lie someone else needed told. Sadie told him she would rather see him lose the job than watch him become someone she couldn't respect anymore. Her words settled something in him. Nolan realized that staying silent now would let Preston send an aircraft with an unresolved fault directly into the sky in front of investors and cameras. He didn't leak the documents publicly or hand anything over to reporters looking for a story. Instead, he filed a formal safety report with the Federal Aviation Oversight Authority and separately with the company's own audit committee, keeping everything through proper channels. Attached to that report were photographs of the painted-over grounding contact, precise timestamps of his original repair, the 7-year-old warning he had submitted long ago, and a formal notice that the aircraft scheduled to fly the next morning had never received full certification. Owen provided a written statement confirming that Nolan had explicitly objected to any premature flight. Mara secured a preserved copy of the original maintenance logbook before Conrad had any chance to alter it further. One of the younger engineers on the 47-person task force, a man named Ethan Cole, admitted privately that Conrad had specifically instructed the team to skip resistance measurements at the airframe contact points. As more employees began telling the truth, Conrad's grip over the department started to loosen visibly. Preston, however, refused to postpone the demonstration flight, convinced that no regulatory body could possibly respond fast enough to interrupt it. The HX-9 was towed out of the hangar the next morning in front of a crowd of investors and television cameras, gleaming under the morning sun. Owen flatly refused to serve as pilot for the flight, standing firm despite pressure from Preston's team. Preston replaced him at the last moment with a contracted outside pilot willing to fly without asking too many questions. Just before the engines were meant to fire, a new voltage warning appeared on the display, different from the original fault but unmistakably related. It confirmed that other contact points throughout the aircraft carried the exact same hidden defect. Preston ordered the warning cleared from the display and told the pilot to proceed regardless of what the system was reporting. At that exact moment, 2 vehicles belonging to the Aviation Oversight Authority pulled onto the airfield, carrying a formal flight suspension order along with instructions to seal every record connected to the HX-9 immediately. Cameras that had been pointed at the aircraft swung toward the arriving vehicles instead, and the murmur among the investors turned into something closer to alarm as officials stepped out and approached the hangar directly. Preston's assistant tried to intercept them at the perimeter, insisting the demonstration was a private company event, but the suspension order carried more weight than any objection he could offer. Bryce slipped quietly toward the parking area, phone already pressed to his ear, while Conrad stood frozen near the tail of the aircraft with the look of a man watching a structure he had built collapse in slow motion. Preston remained closest to the helicopter, still trying to project the calm authority of a man in control of the situation, though the tightness in his jaw told a different story entirely. The demonstration flight was canceled in full view of the assembled investors, an embarrassment Preston couldn't spin his way out of. Furious, he accused Nolan of deliberately sabotaging the company's reputation out of personal spite. Investigators demanded that all 47 engineers appear together for a formal technical review inside the very hangar where the original verdict had been announced. The central question posed to them was almost painfully simple. Had anyone on the team ever directly measured voltage drop at that specific grounding contact? Not a single engineer answered yes. They explained, one after another, that the official procedure never required that particular measurement in the first place. Investigators asked who had been responsible for altering that procedure to begin with. Every pair of eyes in the room slowly turned toward Conrad. Mara presented the original documentation showing the measurement had once been mandatory before Conrad quietly removed it from the process. Ethan Cole handed over an email in which Conrad explicitly forbade the team from investigating any connection to the recent interior refit. Nolan was invited back into the hangar as a technical witness for the proceedings. He didn't mock the 47 engineers standing before him, even though he had every reason to. He explained plainly that they hadn't lacked intelligence or skill. They had been forced to work inside a process deliberately engineered to arrive at the wrong conclusion every single time. That measured, respectful approach shifted something in the room, and several engineers who had once laughed at him began quietly siding with his version of events. An independent inspection team cleaned 3 additional contact points elsewhere in the aircraft that carried the same hidden flaw. Every remaining voltage warning disappeared once those points were properly restored. After a complete and thorough certification process, the HX-9 systems performed with total stability from start to finish. The real material cost of fixing every affected point across the entire aircraft came out to only a few $100s. Eleanor Wexford, chair of the board, ordered an immediate financial investigation into the procurement department's dealings. Records revealed that Bryce had signed contracts for the new helicopter fleet before the engineering team had even finished drafting its final scrap recommendation. Conrad and Bryce began openly blaming each other as the investigation tightened around them. Preston continued insisting that the entire scandal amounted to nothing more than the misconduct of 2 overzealous subordinates acting on their own. Eleanor produced an email carrying Preston's own signature, in which the CEO explicitly instructed Conrad to ensure the HX-9 had, in his exact words, no reasonable path to repair before the upcoming board meeting. The room went still as the message was read aloud in full, and several engineers who had defended Conrad only days earlier now looked at him with an entirely different expression. Ethan Cole shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing how easily his own signature on the earlier joint report could be read as complicity rather than simple obedience. Mara reached over and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a small gesture that seemed to remind him the truth he had already told mattered more than the mistake he had once made. Eleanor set the printed email down on the table beside the stopwatch, letting both objects sit there together as evidence of exactly how far Preston had been willing to go to protect a deal that was never his to protect in the first place. The formal hearing took place inside a glass conference room on the highest floor of the Ashford headquarters. Preston sat in the chair reserved for the chief executive, though it was clear to everyone in the room that he no longer controlled anything happening around him. Eleanor placed the very stopwatch Preston had once used to humiliate Nolan directly onto the center of the table. She asked Nolan to walk the board through exactly how he had identified the fault in the first place. He laid out the reasoning step by step, calm and unhurried, the way he approached every technical problem he'd ever faced. He explained that the fault had appeared only after the interior refit, that the false signal shifted depending on electrical load, that arc scorching had formed around the affected connection, that the access panel had been resealed with fresh paint over the contact surface, and that the resistance measurement capable of catching all of it had been deliberately stripped from procedure. There was no luck anywhere in that sequence, only careful observation applied where it had been forbidden. Mara presented clear evidence that Conrad had personally suppressed Nolan's warning report from 7 years earlier. Owen confirmed under oath that Preston had pushed to fly the aircraft despite the absence of proper safety certification. A forensic auditor demonstrated exactly how Bryce had funneled company funds through the shell company tied to his brother. The email bearing Preston's own signature proved he understood all along that a scrap verdict would clear the path for the board to approve a far more expensive replacement fleet. Preston attempted to defend himself by claiming he had simply pushed his staff toward a difficult but necessary business decision. Eleanor asked him directly why he had fired the one employee who had just saved the company tens of millions of dollars. Preston had no real answer, beyond the fact that Nolan had embarrassed him in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. The board offered Nolan his back pay along with a management position if he agreed to withdraw any formal complaint quietly. Nolan declined that private arrangement without a moment's hesitation. Instead, he asked for several things: reinstatement for every employee who had faced retaliation for telling the truth, a full inspection of the company's entire aircraft fleet, restoration of the technical procedures that had been quietly stripped away, and a transparent account of the investigation shared openly with the staff. Eleanor called for an immediate board vote. Preston was suspended from his position as chief executive before the meeting even adjourned. Conrad and Bryce were both terminated pending the outcome of a broader financial investigation into their conduct. The bonus Preston had been counting on from the replacement fleet purchase was canceled entirely, along with the deal itself. The stopwatch he had once used to mock Nolan still sat on the table in front of him the moment his access badge was deactivated for good. Nobody in the room reached to move it, and for a moment it simply sat there between them, a small plastic object that had somehow outlasted the career of the man who owned it. Eleanor thanked Nolan for his patience through the proceedings, acknowledging that the company had failed him long before Preston ever set that stopwatch down in the hangar. She asked what he needed going forward, not as a formality but as a genuine question, the kind he hadn't been asked by anyone in a position of power in a very long time. Nolan told her he didn't need much, only a guarantee that the next person who noticed something small and inconvenient wouldn't have to fight this hard just to be heard. The change in the culture of the company arrives gently, not all at once, but stitched together through hundreds of small decisions over the following months. Nolan is reinstated with full back pay and formal compensation for his wrongful termination. He is offered a newly created role, Director of Field Reliability, reporting directly to the board's Safety Oversight Committee rather than to any single executive. He turns down the large corner office they offer him without a second thought. Instead, he asks for a small diagnostic room built right beside the maintenance bay, close to the work itself rather than distant from it. Every inch of the HX-9 undergoes a complete reassessment over the following weeks. Not only the original grounding fault, but every wire, sensor, and component that had been swapped out unnecessarily during the earlier misdiagnosis. Owen finally takes the aircraft up for a full test flight once every certification has been properly completed. The helicopter performs flawlessly from takeoff to landing. The board formally cancels the plan to purchase 6 new helicopters, saving the company more than $180 million in the process. Components that had been improperly sold off through the shell company are either recovered outright or fully compensated through legal settlement. All 47 engineers are enrolled in a new training program Nolan personally designs from the ground up. He never once demands a public apology from any of them. He asks only that they remember one simple principle going forward. Diagnostic software delivers data, not the complete truth, and the two are never quite the same thing. Several engineers who had mocked him openly in the early days now approach him privately to shake his hand. Mara is promoted to oversee technical documentation integrity across every division of the company. Owen steps into a newly formed leadership role overseeing flight safety programs company-wide. Preston departs the organization entirely under mounting pressure from shareholders, forfeiting any claim to the year-end bonus he had once counted on. The weight of the Ashford family name proves insufficient to shield him from the consequences of what the board's investigation ultimately uncovered. On the aircraft's first official flight, under the new leadership, the seat once reserved exclusively for Preston sits empty. Nolan stands quietly at the edge of the runway, watching the helicopter climb steadily into open sky. He isn't thinking about the stopwatch anymore, or the laughter that once filled the hangar every time he tried to speak, or even the envelope of cash Preston once handed him as though it could settle the matter for good. He's thinking about the diagnostic room now taking shape beside the maintenance bay, the shelves he still needs to fill, the training materials he wants ready before the next class of engineers arrives. Somewhere behind him, Mara is walking a group of new technicians through updated inspection procedures, her voice carrying faintly across the tarmac. It occurs to him that none of this ever needed to be complicated, that the whole 8-month disaster had come down to one grounding point nobody was allowed to check, and one man willing to check it anyway. Months later, Nolan finishes an ordinary shift right on time and comes home for dinner with Sadie, the two of them settling into the small, familiar rhythm they'd built together. She spots a photograph of the HX-9 on the evening news and asks whether he considers himself a hero for everything that happened. Nolan tells her, honestly, that he was simply the only person willing to look at the one place everyone else had been told not to look. Inside Ashford Aeronautics, the plaque that once listed the names of all 14 engineers assigned to the project remains unchanged, their names still there exactly as before. Beneath it, a single new line has been added, one that now greets every employee who walks past it each morning. It reads that the greatest failure is never simply not knowing the answer, but silencing the people brave enough to keep asking the question. Nolan keeps the old washer from that repair tucked away in his desk drawer, a small, worthless scrap of metal by any normal measure. It carries no monetary value whatsoever, yet it was once enough to get a $30 million aircraft declared permanently unfit to fly. When a young engineer eventually approaches him with a new fault the diagnostic software simply cannot explain, Nolan doesn't reach for his computer right away. He asks instead when the last modification to the system occurred, and exactly who touched the machine right before the trouble started. The young engineer smiles, understanding now that inside these walls, no question is ever considered too small to ask. Together they walk out to the aircraft in question, and Nolan crouches beside the panel the way he always does, running his fingers along the edge before he ever picks up a tool. He talks the younger man through what to look for, not lecturing so much as thinking out loud, the same patient habit that had once gone unheard for years before anyone gave it a chance. It takes them less than 10 minutes to find the answer. a loose connector nobody had thought to recheck after a recent software update. The young engineer writes it down carefully, and Nolan watches him do it, remembering what it felt like to have nobody listen and understanding now exactly why it matters that someone finally does. The story closes with the HX-9 passing low over the hangar under a deep orange sunset, its engines steady and sure. 47 engineers had needed 8 full months to declare that machine dead. One single father had needed only 3 minutes to prove it had never truly been heard at all, and that the loudest room in the building had simply never bothered to listen for the quiet answer sitting right in front of them.
Low faith and high hope? Well, fuck it, bro. I think we got it. Try 3 hits, heavy attack. 3 attacks, dodge, repeat. Is it in Steam? Oh, it's in Steam for sure. They got it for $60. Yep. That was stupid of me. Damn, bro. This guy's so fucking annoying. You got this? Adios, see you later. Oh my god, bro. I definitely pressed it in time. Be for real, bro.